Here we go. And we are on. Here we go. All right, live is setting up, and everyone that's going to see this on YouTube, shalom, YouTube. Happy New Moon Day to our brothers and sisters. In Yahuwah Almighty, Yahushua Messiah, we are the Awakened by Yahuwah Fellowship Group. In Yahuwah Almighty, Yahushua Messiah. Today, I wanted to do a type of theoretical type of study, you could say. It's more of a theory I have, and I have to give credit. I believe the Father Yahuwah used this man Chuck Missler to bring this theory up to me. It's called, this study is going to be called A Non-Egyptian Pharaoh, ? Who is the Assyrian? And we're going to be dealing with scriptures that talk about this tyrannical ruler called the Assyrian, and even a little, basically, there is one scripture from the book of Isaiah that says that they were forcibly carried away to the Assyrians in Egypt when the Hebrews went down into Egypt. So we're going to deal with that. And so it's going to be a fun little study here. So first, let's go to the first scripture on the list. And let's see here. We got, go all the way up to the top here, Isaiah 10:24. And that says here, therefore, thus says Yahuwah of armies. This Sabaoth is actually here in the Greek, but it's not in the Hebrew, which I kind of find funny. But one time it actually has Sabaoth in the Septuagint. The Masoretic has it saying Adonai Yahuwah. So I kind of find that funny. Be not afraid, my people who dwell in Sion, of the Assyrians, because he shall smite you with a rod, for I am bringing a stroke upon you that you may see the way of Egypt. Again, there's like this connection between Egypt and Assyria. And then you go to verse 25 of chapter 14, which many Christian theologians think Isaiah 14 is exclusively talking about Satan, which I kind of disagree with that, because it talks about the king of Babylon. You know, it's addressing the king of Babylon also. So let's see here. Isaiah 14:25 says that I will break the Assyrian in my land, and upon my mountains tread him underfoot. Then shall his yoke depart from off them, and his burden depart from off their shoulders. So that was Isaiah 14:25. So basically, again, Yahuwah is angry at this person called the Assyrian. You know, and the Assyrian is in his land, taking over his land. Remember what's going to happen with the anti-Messiah, end times anti-Messiah. He's going to be taking over Jerusalem. So just something to think about. Isaiah 23:13 says, behold, the land of the Chaldeans. Now it's comparing the Chaldeans, the Babylonians, to Assyria. Behold, the land of the Chaldeans, this people was not. Now he's talking about something before the Chaldeans were even a people. So that's the context here. They were not. Till the Assyrian founded it. So the Assyrian, this person named the Assyrian, found Chaldea, Shinar, Babylon. For them that dwell in the wilderness. Now, the wilderness sometimes in prophecy will refer to the wicked being in a barren land. And some Christians actually understand this concept, spiritually speaking, what a wilderness or a barren land, a desert will, you know, spiritually indicate usually the wicked are in a barren land. They set up the towers thereof. Well, I can think of a tower that goes back to Genesis when the Babylonians were established. I can think of one. They raised up the palaces thereof, and he brought it to ruin. And I want to go to where you can find out who actually founded the Chaldeans, who founded basically these people. You can go back to Genesis 10:11 and who exactly founded Assyria. I want to go to Genesis 10, verse 11 here, to get some context here. Because Genesis 10:11 says, and out of that land, what land? In the land of Shinar, previous verse. Shinar, Babylon. Out of that land went forth Ashur, Assyria, and builded Nineveh. So Nimrod found Assyria, Nineveh, Rehoboth, Calah, Shinar, Babylon. Okay, so technically Babylon and Assyria are like one and the same land-wise geographically, because out of Assyria came Babylon. So, I mean, you could even interpret that like they're the same region even. So that's just something to keep in context. So that was Genesis 10:11 there to match up with Isaiah 23:13. Then you go down to Isaiah 30, verse 31. For though the voice of Yahuwah shall the Assyrian be beaten down, which smote with a rod. Again, Yahuwah is angry against this person called the Assyrian. And then if you go to the next chapter of Isaiah 31, verse 8, then shall the Assyrian fall in the sword, not of a mighty man, and the sword, not of a mean man, shall devour him, but he shall flee from the sword, and his young men shall be discomfited. And then if you go to, I think to me, this is the smoking gun right here, in my opinion. Isaiah 52, 4-5 says, thus says Yahuwah, my people went down before to Egypt to sojourn there. When did that happen? I mean, obviously he's referring to the Exodus. He's referring to that time period when Joseph and his brothers and Israel, Jacob, went all the way down into Egypt to sojourn there, and were carried away forcibly, by force, to the Assyrians. And then if you look at the Masoretic, your Masoretic Old Testament Bibles will actually translate it into English, the word Ashur, as the Assyrian. Okay, so obviously that would be why I believe it was a non-Egyptian pharaoh. And we'll, at the end of this, we're going to get to Exodus chapter 1, verse 8, and I'll show you why I believe that, that I believe even his ethnicity was different from the pharaoh of Joseph's time. Ezekiel chapter 31, verse 3 says, behold, the Assyrian was a cedar in Lebanon, with fair branches and with a shadowing shroud and on high stature, and his top was among thick boughs. Now, I want to just go to Amos chapter 2, verse 9 to show you why I think it's important with this allegorical language of talking about a person being a cedar. What is he actually talking about in context? If you go to Amos 2:9, talking about the Amorites, okay, one of the tribes of giants that came from Canaan's lineage, okay, says in Amos 2:9, yet I destroyed the Amorite before them, whose height was like the height of the cedars, and he was strong as the oaks, yet I destroyed his fruit from above and his roots from beneath. So in my opinion, Ezekiel 31 is using the same type of context in that verse. Okay, it's talking about a person, you know, someone that is mortal being a cedar. So it's basically it's talking about this person, the Assyrian, is as tall as a cedar tree, and he has a very high stature. That's what it's saying here in Ezekiel 31:3. And it says, and his top was among the thick boughs. So I mean his top, his head, would have been that high up. So another reason I believe this connects the Assyrian to Nimrod himself. And if you look at Genesis 10:8 in the Septuagint, I believe there's an interesting connection here. Genesis chapter 10, verse 8 in the Septuagint, instead of mighty man, okay, and this is another thing I really like about the Septuagint is they understand the difference between a mighty warrior and a giant. Even though they're using the same Hebrew word to translate in certain places for David's mighty men as mighty men, they knew the difference when to translate the same Hebrew word into two different Greek words depending on the context. So that's another thing too. The translators of the Septuagint manuscript understood, depending on the context, it can refer to mighty human warriors or to giants. The word Gibor, you can look it up in the modern Hebrew. Gibborim can sometimes refer to giants. It's not always mighty men. Genesis 10:8, and Cush begot Nimrod. He began to be a giant upon the earth. To me, this makes sense because it says the Assyrian was a cedar in Lebanon. Amos 2:9, the Amorites' height was as a cedar. So I think all that is, it's all talking about the same context. It's talking about someone that is as tall as a cedar tree. And Nimrod, if he began to be a giant, he would have been as tall as a cedar tree. So I think that all connects there, in my opinion. Hosea 5, verse 13, when Ephraim saw his wickedness and Judah saw his wound, then went Ephraim to the Assyrian and sent to King Yareb, yet could he not heal you nor cure you of your wound. Now, in this context, Hosea 5:13 is more or less talking about the Assyrian of that time period was Sennacherib, the king of Assyria. So in that context, it's a little different because we obviously know, historically speaking, that is talking about when they were led into captivity, you had Sennacherib, king of Assyria, and Yahuwah gave them into Assyria. So that's a little different, but let me see here. Hosea 11, verse 5, he shall not return into the land of Egypt, but the Assyrian shall be his king, because they refuse to return. Again, this is talking about Sennacherib, I believe, in that context. Then you have Micah 5:5, which is a very interesting prophecy. Again, it goes back to this Assyrian person. And this man shall be the peace. Who's our peace? Who's our shalom? Yahusha. So this is a prophecy talking about the Messiah, Yahusha, rescuing us from this person, the Assyrian. And this man shall be the peace when the Assyrian shall come into our land, and when he shall tread in our palaces. Then shall we raise against him 7 shepherds and 8 principal men. And then if you go to the next verse here, Micah 5:6, and they shall waste the land of Assyria with the sword, and the land of Nimrod. Again, Genesis 10, he found Assyria. Okay. In the entrances thereof, thus shall he deliver us from the Assyrian. So Yahusha is delivering us from this person that's known as Ashur, that is translated as the Assyrian, when he comes into our land and when he treads within our borders. And then you have the last cross-reference I have here before we go to the Exodus chapter 1, verse 8, is Isaiah chapter 10, verse 5. Assyrian, the rod of my anger, the staff in their hand is my indignation. So, this seems to be a person Yahuwah is not fond of at all. Someone that's constantly oppressing his people, constantly, being the rod of his anger. He's constantly angry at the Assyrian. So, and the last cross-reference I want to do here, and I should have had it copy and pasted before, but here we go. It says, Exodus chapter 1, verse 8, in the Septuagint here, says, and there arose up another king over Egypt who knew not Joseph. Okay, if you look at the Greek word for another here, it's pretty interesting. Where we get the word in our English, heterosexual, heteros, okay, a different kind. And it says altered. Well, I mean, you never know. Altered, Nimrod began to be a giant. Who knows? This guy might have been a descendant of Nimrod, this pharaoh. I don't think Nimrod was the pharaoh, obviously, because he was dead at this point. But maybe this pharaoh that did not know Joseph was, altered, you could say. had corrupted genetics, maybe. It says strange can be, think about it, strange. If the Israelites considered someone strange, that would be someone not of their lineage, right? The strange woman, the strangers, someone that's not indigenous to their land is a stranger, a sojourner. Just saying, something to think about. And then if you go to the Greek lexicon, it talks about, see here, heteros, the other, another, other, the other two, not of the same nature. I mean, you could say that's spiritual, but I think it's more than spiritual. I think that would be literal. Like a literal, not of the same nature, like not the same ethnicity. I definitely think there was a spiritual matter too. No, I'm not trying to, diminish that. I think it's very possible that, Joseph could have converted the Pharaoh, the Pharaoh that knew him and was on good terms with Joseph could have possibly been converted like Nebuchadnezzar was. I mean, but I think there's much more to it than just a spiritual aspect. That one was monotheistic versus polytheistic. I think there was more of a ethnic tone to it too. So that's something I wanted to share. I just also wanted to share a video. See here if I can get this up here. And again, this was brought, I basically came across this a little while ago. It was probably a year or so ago. Let me see if I can find this real quick. It says Chuck Missler, The Return of Nimrod. And to me, this is pretty interesting. This would kind of provoke my thought to create this study. So here we go.
And that's the return of Nimrod.
All right, let me make sure. Let me put it on full screen. Yeah, share computer sound. Here we go. It's a little like 9-minute video.
Nimrod, the original world dictator. When we started this series, we took a look at the earliest empires from the Fertile Crescent, Egypt, Assyria, Babylonia. And of course, Daniel gives us a profile in advance of the empires from Babylon on. The Babylonian Empire, the city of Babylon, becomes prominent in both the Old and New Testament passages. Babylon was conquered by the Persians, and the Persians were in turn conquered by the Greeks. And the Greek Empire actually breaks up under Alexander. In Daniel chapter 11, we have the handover from the Persian Empire to the Greek Empire. The first couple of verses deals with those successors to Cyrus. You remember Cyrus? He conquered Babylon in Daniel 5. He had a letter written to him 150 years before he was born in Isaiah 45. He's succeeded by Cambyses, Artaxerxes, Darius, and then Xerxes I, who is the king that is prominent in the book of Esther. He's also the king that conducts a disastrous campaign against the Greeks and really provides the motivation for Alexander 150 years later to take over the Persians. Xerxes is followed by Artaxerxes Longimanus, and he's famous, of course, to us because he gave the decree to rebuild Jerusalem that triggers the 70 weeks of Daniel. But that brings us to Alexander the Great, the close of the Persian Empire and the beginning of what we call the Greek Empire. But when Alexander dies, the empire gets divided among his 4 generals. Cassander takes Macedonia and Greece, Lysimachus, Asia Minor and Thrace, and Syria and Babylon go to Seleucus, and Egypt, Arabia, and Israel go to Ptolemy. It's Seleucus and Ptolemy that become key to our investigation. And they are prominent in Daniel chapter 11, and they are key to understanding the prophecies having to do with the Antichrist. When the empire divided, of course, Cassander and Lysimachus take places that aren't prominent in our narrative. Seleucus takes the lion's share, Ptolemy, of course, Egypt. But the dynasties that succeed from these 2 leaders war for several centuries, Israel, of course, being caught between them as a buffer state. In Daniel chapter 11, from verse 5 through 35, we have written in advance the careers of the leaders in both of these series. The Ptolemies, from Ptolemy I right on through to Ptolemy VI. and from Seleucus all the way through to a climactic one called Antiochus Epiphanes. And what's so fascinating, I encourage you to really study these details in Daniel 11 with some good encyclopedias, and you'll be startled to realize that the careers of these leaders are written well in advance. They're so detailed, so clear, that cynics and skeptics have tried to late date Daniel. But fortunately, it is one of the best documented books in the Bible, and furthermore, it was translated into Greek 3 centuries before Christ's ministry. But the thing that's relevant to our inquiry here is that following Antiochus Epiphanes, who's clearly presented as a type of this final world leader, we continue to have, for the rest of the chapter, the next 10 verses.
Yeah, what I find interesting, too, is that it seems like Antiochus, he thought himself to be a god. Antiochus Theos. So you got, yeah, he's a definite anti-Messiah character, no doubt. Antiochus Theos. He's, that's kind of interesting. So he was a successor, one of the successors to Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great had, I believe scripture says in the book of Daniel, the 4 horns that came from the one horn of Alexander the Great. So, you know. So anyway, so he's going to continue on to this, and I think he's going to start talking about the Assyrian towards the end of this 9-minute clip.
Detailed prophecies about the Antichrist that are expressed in terms as a successor, as a king of the north. Now, as we stand back from all of this, we realize that history consists of 7 super kingdoms of Satan. In Revelation 12:3, it says, "There appeared another wonder in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 crowns upon his heads." And of course, as we look at the parade of...
Just for a disclaimer for all the viewers and listeners, I do not agree with his assertion that the last kingdom is a revived Roman Empire. That's mainly a Christian interpretation that is pretty much man-made, and nowhere in scripture does it say the Rome is going to rise up again. Rome never fell, to be honest. The thing is that this kingdom right here never fell. It never actually fell, because once they turned the Roman Empire into a Christian empire, pagan Rome really never fell. They just disguised themselves. That's all they did. So this whole revived Roman Empire is based on the basis that pagan Rome fell, that the assumption that the kingdom up here fell, which there's no proof to that. So I just wanted to put my 2 cents in for that. And I think the actual last kingdom that talks about crushing the iron, and it talks about iron mixing with clay, I think it's more or less 2 different kinds mixing. It's not really as political as it is physical. I think more or less you're going to see more of like the end times beast kingdom is going to be more of a genetic hybrid type of kingdom rather than, you know, a political kingdom like, and just only consisting of one country, if that makes any sense. So anyway.
Empires, we realize that there are 7 of them. Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome, and then Rome in a second phase. These last empires, which I'll call Daniel's 4+1, are of course familiar to us because when Daniel wrote during the Babylonian captivity, he detailed Nebuchadnezzar's dream and also a series of visions that he had and lays out that history in advance. Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome, and then Rome in 2 phases. So there's really 4 empires, but the last one comes in 2 phases. And I think most scholars recognize that Rome, and what I'll call Rome II, or Rome Revisited, is really expressed in the same idioms in Daniel's prophecies, in Daniel 2 and 7, and so on. And this is also picked up in Revelation 13, 17, and so on. Now, there is a verse in Revelation 17 that constantly puzzles us. I've studied this for many decades. I've searched all the commentators, and none of them really make clear what the 10th verse of Revelation 17 says it. John tells us, and there are 7 kings. 5 are fallen, 1 is, and the other is not yet come. And when he cometh, he must continue a short space. Well, when you stand back from these empires, it's pretty clear. The 5 that are fallen, when John is writing, of course, is Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Persia, and Greece, because he's writing during the Roman period. He says 1 is, and that of course, is Rome itself. And the other is not yet come. And that, of course, is Rome 2, as I'll call it here, characterized by these famous 10 horns, which, of course, are detailed in Daniel 2 and 7, Revelation 13 and 17, and so on. And when he cometh, he must continue a short space. All well and good, but the next verse in chapter 17 is puzzling. And the beast that was and is not, even he is the 8th, but he is of the 7, and goeth into perdition. Well, which of these, obviously this is referring to what I'll call the 11th horn. We all know about the 10 horns, but there's a little horn in Daniel 7, Daniel 8 that comes up and takes over. So the 11th horn is a reasonable title for this coming world leader. But this is the one that was and is not. Now he's the 8th. Clearly he's the 8th in the sense of these leaderships here.
Now something I just want to iterate here, which I kind of find funny, he brings up 17:11 of Revelations. If you think about it, all these 7 kingdoms, what do they all have in common? What's the deity they all worship? Okay, you got Egypt, Osiris. Who's Osiris? Babylon, Nimrod. Greece, Adonis. Okay, Rome, Zeus, Jupiter. Zeus would be Greece too. So it's kind of funny he mentions this verse. I think Nimrod's the 8th. If you look at all these nations, they all have 1 horn that they worship. So, technically he is of the 7 in that type of interpretation, because he is the horn that, isn't there scripture that talks about Yahuwah is the horn of my salvation? Just something to think about, It's very possible that he's literally of the 7 because he's literally the deity that these 7 worship. But anyway, not to get carried away.
And yet he is of the 7, which means in some sense he is from this list of 7. But he was that which was and is not. Which of these 7?
Oh yeah, and I also want to reiterate on that. I think most of my brothers and sisters here would agree with me. The phrasing of was and is not is referring to he was the beasts. He was the beast, the original beast, and he is not the true Messiah. He is the false Messiah. So that's what that verse is actually saying. The one that was and is not, because what's Yahushua? He's the one that was and is. Just something to think about. So, Revelation 17:11 could be giving us some clues here. Just saying.
Existed, but doesn't exist today. Well, clearly, Egypt, Babylon, Persia, and Greece, and Rome all have vestiges present on our horizon. There's one that's mysteriously absent from archaeological history as well as secular history, and that's namely Assyria. I'd like to explore this a little further because I think it's been overlooked. You notice when the rise of Rome occurs, they conquered Greece in 146 BC, Lysimachus' kingdom in 133 BC, then Seleucus' kingdom in 64 BC, and finally Egypt in 31 BC, Ptolemy's kingdom. So little by little, Rome absorbed what previously was Alexander's empire. They all disappear, in effect, before the birth of Christ. But all of us fall into the trap when we think of the Roman Empire of confining our horizon to the western leg of it. The eastern leg of the Roman Empire endured for 1,000 years more after the western leg fell. We call it the Byzantine Empire, but that's our label. It's really the vestige of the Roman Empire. And it consists of nations that we often don't think of as Roman, especially Seleucus' kingdom. Now, it's interesting, in recent history, each of these elements have reemerged. In 1906, Iran reemerges. 1921, Afghanistan gets their independence. In 1922, Egypt and Iraq. 24, Turkey, then Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and finally, of course, Pakistan.
Interesting. The same year, Iraq reemerges with Egypt. Interesting. Okay, so Iraq, for those that don't know biblical geography, modern day Iraq originally was Shinar, Babylon. So I kind of find it funny that Mitzrayim in 1922 reemerged around the same time as Iraq. I don't believe in coincidences. That's all I'm going to say about that.
And Israel. Now it's interesting, Egypt, of course, was Ptolemy's turf in those days, way back. The rest of these, with the exception of Iran, the rest of these are Seleucus. Actually, Turkey is Seleucus and Lysimachus together, but notice that all the elements of Seleucus and Ptolemy have resurfaced in our modern history. And it's interesting that two of these, Iraq and Syria, constitute what used to be called, prior to the Babylonian Empire, Assyria. Very, very unique, distinctive culture, and about which the Bible has much to say. In fact, it's interesting to realize that in Isaiah 10 and Micah 5, what the person we call the Antichrist is called the Assyrian. I think we need to really focus on this guy. When we get to Micah, there's an interesting passage. It says, "This one shall be the peace," speaking of course of the Messiah, "when the Assyrian shall come into our land, and when he shall tread in our palaces, then shall we rise up against him 7 shepherds and 8 principal men." Could it be the 7 angels pouring out wrath? Could it be the Messiah coming? "And they shall waste the land of Assyria with the sword, and the land of Nimrod in the entrances thereof. Thus shall he deliver us from the Assyrian, when he cometh into our land, when he treadeth within our borders." Now some people will say that this occurred in history, except you may recall when the Assyrians, while they did capture the northern part of the kingdom, when they tried to get Jerusalem, Sennacherib was confronted with an angel that slaughtered 185,000 of his troops that night, and he went back and never tried again. So they never did. Assyria did not enter Jerusalem and the area of Judah.
And I would pose the question to the viewers and listeners, who do you think that angel was? Who do you think that angel was that confronted a type of Nimrod? That's all I'm going to say. Something to look into for yourself, and that's a study I want to do separate from this study in the future, is who is the angel of Yahuwah that appears as a deliverer to Yashar'al, to Israel in the Tanakh, and saves them in many instances. And Yahuwah said himself, "My angel which I send before you, do not disobey him, for he will not forgive your sin, for my name is on him." Just something to think about. So anyway, my prayer today would be that any non-believers or any people that have not accepted Yahusha today, this would encourage you to accept the true Messiah, Yahusha. And for our brothers and sisters out there that have already accepted Yahusha, that are, already walking, have allowed Yahuwah's Spirit to cause them to walk uprightly and righteously, that I pray that this would help you understand the end times a little bit better and understand why stuff like this is important to understand, and to kind of see the pattern of the spirit of Satan using these tyrants throughout history. And obviously there's a pattern here. He's trying to destroy the first male child with this Pharaoh of Egypt, and then Satan, he possesses Herod to do that when Yahusha's about to be born in the times of the Brit Hadashah. And then, so there's a pattern here. So my prayer today would be that this helps you guys understand, and maybe it poses some provoking thought. Maybe there's something to this Pharaoh of the Exodus, why he's so much different than the Pharaoh that, was on good terms with Joseph, which it seems like him and Joseph were actually, good friends, So, thank you for joining us today, and have a great rest of your new moon day. To our brothers and sisters, Shabbat Shalom. Oh, not Shabbat Shalom, my bad. Shalom.
Shalom.